It began, as so many great investigations do, with something small, something so insignificant that most would have ignored it. The radar technician at Luke Air Force Base had been staring at green screens for hours, half asleep on a dull Tuesday night in 1987, when a flicker caught his eye. A blip, a faint, dancing dot, appeared out of nowhere near the U.S. Mexico border. It darted north, then vanished. He leaned closer, rubbed his eyes, adjusted the gain. Nothing. Then, minutes later, another blip appeared, slightly to the east, moving erratically. It too vanished before the computer could lock on. "Sir, I've got something strange on my scope," he radioed, hesitant. "Define strange," his superior replied, half bored. "It's too slow for a jet. Too fast for a bird. No transponder. And it's flying low, under 1,000 feet." A pause. Then the calm, routine voice of experience, "Probably a glitch. Go get some coffee." But the blips kept coming. Over the next week, different bases across Arizona and New Mexico reported the same anomalies, faint radar ghosts slipping across the desert at night, hugging the terrain, then vanishing before anyone could scramble a jet. When the Air Force realized these ghosts were appearing only in certain sectors, areas notorious for cross-border smuggling, they quietly notified the DEA. The Drug Enforcement Administration, in turn, called the FBI. That's when Special Agent Mark Sullivan entered the picture. Mark Sullivan was not your typical field agent. He wasn't a brawler or a cowboy, he was an analyst with the instincts of a hunter and the patience of a chess player. He had a reputation for spotting patterns no one else could see, the kind that made bureaucrats nervous. When the DEA handed him the radar data, he frowned. "These aren't random," he said, tracing a line between the radar blips on a map. "They form a corridor, right across Sonora into Arizona, straight through the desert valleys. Whoever's doing this knows exactly where our radar coverage ends." The theory sounded absurd. The 1980s drug trade was dominated by big aircraft, cargo planes, and boats loaded with cocaine from Colombia. The idea that smugglers might be using something smaller, something invisible to radar, was laughable. But then, a week later, a rancher near Nogales called the sheriff to report something strange. He'd found a tiny crashed aircraft tangled in mesquite bushes on his property. It wasn't a Cessna or a crop duster. It was an ultralight, a flimsy skeleton of aluminum tubing and nylon fabric, the kind hobbyists flew for fun on weekends. The pilot was gone. When deputies arrived, they were puzzled. The plane's frame was scorched, its propeller bent, its gas tank empty. But what caught their attention was the fine white dust coating the engine housing. They assumed it was desert powder, until the lab results came back. It was cocaine. The FBI immediately sealed the site. Mark Sullivan drove out himself, kneeling beside the wreckage under the baking Arizona sun. The ultralight looked absurdly fragile, like something a teenager might build in his garage. Yet this tiny contraption had crossed an international border, carrying drugs worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He walked around the crash site slowly, noticing tire tracks nearby, likely from a truck that had offloaded the payload. The pilot, whoever he was, had probably fled on foot. Who in their right mind would fly something like this across the desert? One deputy muttered. Sullivan didn't answer. He was thinking about radar, how small, slow, and low these aircraft could fly. Below a few hundred feet, radar waves curved right over them. To the military's billion-dollar systems, these planes might as well be ghosts. He turned to the sheriff. "Get me a list of anyone within 50 miles who owns or builds ultralights. Mechanics, hobbyists, anyone." The list turned out to be longer than expected. Arizona, with its wide-open skies and lenient flying laws, had hundreds of enthusiasts. But one name stood out, Carl Dennison, a retired machinist who sold custom kits for ultralight modifications out of his garage. When Sullivan arrived at Dennison's home, he found the man nervous, jittery, and chain-smoking. "Agent Sullivan, I swear, I don't know anything about no drugs," Dennison blurted before the agent had even asked a question. "Who said anything about drugs?" Sullivan replied evenly. Dennison's eyes darted to the door. "Look, I sell kits. Engines, frames, wing fabrics. Some buyers pay cash, no questions asked. I don't ask where they're flying." Sullivan pressed. "How many of your kits could fly 200 miles non-stop at night?" Dennison hesitated. Depends on the engine and the pilot. Maybe 50, 60 of them. Mostly out-of-towners. Mexicans, a few Californians. And you didn't think that was strange? Dennison swallowed hard. I thought they were racing clubs. The FBI seized Dennison's sales records. Dozens of buyers used aliases or fake addresses, but one contact kept appearing in the margins, a man known only as audacious. He paid in cash, ordered in bulk, and preferred his ultralights equipped with oversized fuel tanks and low-noise propellers. Sullivan's instinct screamed cartel. By late summer, the FBI and DEA had pieced together the outline of something unprecedented: smugglers using ultralight aircraft to ferry drugs across the border at night, flying just above cactus height, invisible to radar and too quiet for patrols to hear. The aircraft would land on pre-arranged dirt roads in Arizona, where trucks waited to pick up the cargo. Then the pilots would refuel, fly back across the border, and vanish. The press had no idea. Neither did most of the government. Only a small task force, dubbed Operation Desert Veil, knew the truth, and even they didn't yet grasp how big the scheme was. One night, Sullivan stood on a desert ridge with binoculars, scanning the dark horizon. The air was still. Then, faintly, he heard it, a distant buzzing, like a lawnmower drifting through the night. He looked up and caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow gliding against the stars, silent, low, fast. Ghosts on the radar, he murmured. And for the first time, he believed it. The desert at night can be deceiving. It hums with life but hides its secrets well. The faint whir of a mosquito can sound like a motor, the glint of starlight can mimic a wing. But for Agent Mark Sullivan, the sound he'd heard that night wasn't imagination. It was the buzz of something mechanical, deliberate, and very, very real. In the weeks that followed, reports began pouring in from across the border states: small aircraft lights spotted at low altitudes, odd engine noises in the dark, and inexplicable tire tracks in the middle of nowhere. Each report on its own meant little. Together, they painted a pattern, one that made Sullivan's pulse quicken. The FBI was now sure that someone was flying narcotics across the border in ultralights. But how, and who? Sullivan requested permission to lead a field investigation into northern Mexico, under coordination with Mexican federal police. The plan was risky. Ultralight operations were mobile, secretive, and backed by violent cartels. The locals didn't trust outsiders, and the authorities were riddled with leaks. Still, Sullivan had a lead: the mysterious buyer from Dennison's records, audacious. He found his first clue in a small town called Santa Ana, about 60 miles south of the U.S. border. There, on the edge of a dusty airstrip, stood a corrugated metal hangar that reeked of fuel and hot oil. A local mechanic, nervous but talkative after a modest bribe, confirmed Sullivan's suspicions. "Si, senor, we see them at night," the man said, glancing toward the hangar. "No airplanes, too small for that. Like motorized kites. They come and go fast. No lights, no radio. The pilots wear black." Sullivan stepped closer, careful not to reveal his badge. "Who runs it?" The man shrugged. "A ghost. They call him El Fantasma." El Fantasma, the ghost. It was the first time Sullivan heard the name that would come to haunt him. Later that night, Sullivan crept toward the airstrip under the cover of darkness. Through binoculars, he saw movement: men unloading crates from a van, refueling small crafts that looked more like bicycles with wings. The ultralights were crude but efficient, fitted with oversized fuel tanks, muffled engines, and painted matte black to disappear against the desert sky. He watched as one man climbed aboard, strapped in, and started the motor. The buzzing was faint, almost insect-like. The craft rolled forward, picked up speed, and lifted off, vanishing into the night. No lights, no sound, gone. Sullivan whispered into his radio, "It's real. They're flying them. The radar ghosts are smugglers." By morning, the hangar was empty. The men were gone, the aircraft vanished. Only footprints and empty fuel drums remained. But on one wall, faintly spray-painted in black, Sullivan saw a crude symbol, a skull wearing goggles and wings. Beneath it, 3 letters, EC. Eladio Cruz, he murmured. It was a name that would soon become infamous. Cruz had once been a mechanic for a major cartel in Sinaloa. But when Mexican authorities began cracking down on air trafficking in the early 80s, Cruz reinvented the game. Instead of big planes, he built small ones. Using his background in aviation maintenance and street engineering, he began constructing ultralights modified for stealth smuggling. He called them Los Pajaros Invisibles, the invisible birds. Cruz's genius was simplicity. Big aircraft drew attention, ultralights did not. They could carry 150 to 200 pounds of cocaine, just enough to make the risk worth it. And if one crashed or got caught, the loss was minimal compared to a full plane. It was the perfect loophole in the billion-dollar war on drugs. The FBI soon realized that Cruz's operation wasn't just clever, it was industrial. U.S. intelligence estimated that by mid-1988, as many as 300 flights a month were crossing undetected. That was equivalent to several tons of cocaine entering the U.S. monthly, right under their noses. Back in Tucson, Sullivan briefed a small circle of agents and Air Force liaisons. They're using ultralights modified with larger tanks and mufflers. They take off from hidden strips in Sonora and land on dirt roads or ranch fields in Arizona. They fly low, under radar. We can't track them with standard systems. A young radar specialist scoffed. Ultralights? That's absurd. You can't run an international drug empire on lawnmowers with wings. Sullivan stared at him. Tell that to the millions of dollars we're missing every week. The room fell silent. The more Sullivan dug, the stranger things became. He learned that Cruz's pilots weren't hardened criminals but hobbyists, recruited from ultralight clubs across the Southwest. Many were middle-aged men, thrill-seekers, small-time smugglers, or desperate souls lured by promises of easy money. They were paid per flight, sometimes $10,000 for a single run. Cruz had even built training camps disguised as aerial sports schools. Recruits learned night navigation, terrain flying, and evasion tactics. If caught, they were told to claim ignorance, just a recreational pilot who got lost. Some never came back. Their ultralights crashed in the desert, devoured by sand and silence. Coyotes found them before the authorities did. But to the cartel, they were expendable. The media remained oblivious. The FBI couldn't risk leaks, so everything stayed classified. But the problem was growing. In just 6 months, Border Patrol had intercepted several abandoned ultralights near Nogales, Sierra Vista, and Yuma, all stripped of their cargo, all untraceable. And then came the first body. A local sheriff found the wreckage of a downed ultralight near the Gila River, its pilot slumped over, head caved in by the crash. But when the coroner examined the body, he found something shocking. The man's fingertips were raw, the skin burned away by acid. His teeth had been removed. Someone had made sure he couldn't be identified. Sullivan stood over the body in the morgue, his jaw clenched. They're cleaning up loose ends. That's when he realized, this wasn't a ragtag smuggling ring. It was a disciplined operation, built on fear, silence, and money. And its leader, El Fantasma, was a ghost who knew exactly how to stay invisible. One evening, as the task force gathered radar data from the Air Force, Sullivan noticed something chilling. The radar blips weren't random after all. They followed a schedule, same times, same routes, like clockwork. He looked up at the glowing map, then at his exhausted team. They've turned the border into an air highway, he said quietly. And we're standing under it. A younger agent muttered, so what do we do? Sullivan's answer was simple. We hunt the ghost. By the spring of 1988, Agent Mark Sullivan's office wall looked more like a conspiracy theorist's dream than an FBI workspace. Maps of Arizona and Sonora were plastered with red strings, pushpins, and scribbled notes. Radar charts lay stacked on his desk like a storm had blown through. Every dot, every flight path, every crash site, connected. But there was one thread still missing, the man known only as El Fantasma. Who was he really? The DEA had fragments of intelligence. The name Ilidio Cruz appeared in connection with cartel supply lines during the late 70s. A mechanic, an engineer, a fixer. But Cruz had vanished after a raid in Sinaloa in 1983. No arrest. No body. Just whispers. Now, years later, his signature was written across the sky. The FBI's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a nervous, sunburnt man in his early 30s named Timothy T.J. Raines. He'd been caught at a small airfield near Tucson, trying to sell a stripped-down ultralight to a biker gang. Relax, TJ, Sullivan said during interrogation, sliding him a cup of coffee. You're not the first to get mixed up with the wrong crowd. I ain't mixed up with nobody, Rains muttered, eyes darting around the room. I just build stuff, man. Hobby planes. That's all. Sullivan leaned forward. And what do your hobby planes carry across the border at 2 in the morning? Rains froze. Then, after a long silence, he whispered, You don't understand. These people, they ain't regular smugglers. They fly like ghosts. He told Sullivan everything. How he'd been recruited through a pilot club in California by a smooth-talking Mexican man who called himself Iladio. How the pay was irresistible, $10,000 per flight, cash. The jobs were simple: take off from a private ranch, fly at night without lights, land on a dirt road near Douglas, drop the cargo, and go home. What if you crash? Sullivan asked. Rains looked down. Then you're just gone. From Rains's testimony, the FBI learned the scale of Cruz's operation. He had dozens of pilots on rotation, many Americans, trained to fly dangerously low, skimming over canyons and treetops. They navigated by moonlight and compass, often without radio communication. The ultralights themselves were masterpieces of improvisation: silent engines, lightweight frames, muffled exhausts, even wings painted with heat-absorbing black matte to confuse infrared detection. Cruz paid attention to every detail. He's not just smuggling drugs, Sullivan said during a debriefing. He's running an air force. Iladio, El Fantasma, Cruz was not the monster Sullivan expected. When Mexican intelligence finally handed over a grainy surveillance photo, the man in it looked ordinary. Medium height, lean, with a calm, unreadable expression. A mechanic's hands, not a killer's. But behind those eyes lay a kind of precision, the mind of someone who saw systems, not crimes. Rumor had it that Cruz had once worked on radar systems for the Mexican Air Force before turning to the cartel after being dismissed in a corruption scandal. He used that knowledge to build a new kind of smuggling empire, one that could fly unseen. He was also notorious for his strange code of ethics. He forbade his pilots from carrying weapons and treated the operation like a business, not a war. He even paid compensation to families of pilots who died in crashes. But if anyone betrayed him, they vanished without a trace. One pilot who escaped to the U.S. described him best. El Fantasma doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He just looks at you, and you realize he's already planned how you'll die. The FBI task force expanded. The Air Force lent technicians to help recalibrate radar to detect small, low-flying objects. They even repurposed Cold War technology, sensitive motion radar designed to catch enemy helicopters. Still, the smugglers adapted faster. They flew in patterns that mimicked migrating birds. Some carried radar reflectors, metallic foil kites that confused sensors. Others deliberately triggered false blips to mislead patrols. Frustrated agents started calling them sky pirates. It was half joke, half admission of defeat. One night, Sullivan joined a surveillance team stationed near the border. The desert was still and wide, the stars bright enough to cut glass. Hours passed with nothing but static in their earpieces. Then, faintly, the familiar buzz came. There, an agent hissed, pointing skyward. A shape materialized against the moon, gliding effortlessly. For a second, Sullivan could see it clearly, a black-winged ultralight, no lights, no sound except the hum of its small propeller. The pilot's goggles caught the moonlight, 2 cold flashes before the craft dipped low and vanished behind a ridge. Let's move! The convoy roared to life, chasing the signal. But by the time they reached the site, there was nothing, no aircraft, no pilot, only fresh tire tracks leading toward a dirt road that faded into the desert. Like chasing ghosts, muttered one of the agents. Sullivan clenched his jaw. Then we'll learn to haunt them back. Weeks later, a lucky break came from a border patrol sensor near Ajo, Arizona. An ultralight had crashed on takeoff from a hidden airstrip. When the FBI arrived, the craft was still smoldering. Inside, they found 50 kilos of cocaine, and something far stranger. A small notebook. Most of the entries were engineering notes, wind speed, flight times, fuel ratios. But at the bottom of one page, scrawled in Spanish, was a phrase that chilled Sullivan. Trust only the men who see the radar. It was cryptic, but to Sullivan, it screamed of an inside leak. Someone with access to radar schedules and patrol rotations was feeding Cruz's operation. It explained how the ultralights always slipped through at perfect times, never when military radar was active, never during joint patrols. There was a traitor somewhere within the system. At FBI headquarters, Sullivan presented the evidence to his superiors. He's getting help from the inside. Someone's giving him radar gaps, probably from customs or air defense. That's how he stays invisible. The room buzzed with tension. A senior official leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. You're suggesting a federal mole aiding drug traffickers with military data? That's a serious accusation, Agent Sullivan. Sullivan stared him down. So is flying 2 tons of cocaine into Arizona every month without a single interception. The official exhaled sharply. We'll consider your theory. For now, stick to your job. Sullivan left the meeting seething. Bureaucracy was always slow to move, slower, sometimes, than crime itself. That night, he looked out over the city lights of Tucson and thought of the ghosts flying unseen above the desert. For every crash they found, 10 more went unnoticed. And behind it all, a man with a mechanic's hands and a strategist's mind, Eladio Cruz, was laughing in the dark. But soon, Cruz would make a mistake. And when he did, the ghosts would no longer be the only ones hunted. The desert has its own kind of silence, the kind that amplifies every heartbeat. For Agent Mark Sullivan, it had become the sound of obsession. By the summer of 1988, the FBI's war against El Fantasma's aerial smugglers had reached a tipping point. Every week, radar blips appeared, drugs vanished into the U.S., and Washington grew impatient. They demanded results. So, Sullivan gave them a plan. He called it Operation Desert Veil, a coordinated effort between the FBI, DEA, and U.S. Air Force to unmask the ghosts of the night sky. If El Fantasma used stealth and silence, Sullivan would use science and patience. The plan hinged on a bold idea, repurposing retired military radar systems, designed to track low-flying helicopters in Vietnam, and adapting them to detect ultralights. These older radar systems, unlike modern high-altitude units, could sweep the terrain with finer granularity, perfect for spotting the whisper-thin contrails of Cruz's smugglers. Gentlemen, Sullivan told the assembled agents and technicians, we're going to hunt kites with cannons. The room erupted in cautious laughter, but the mood was tense. A week later, in a secret hangar outside Tucson, Air Force engineers set up the first prototype radar array, an enormous, humming relic with cables snaking across the floor. The FBI agents gathered around as the technician powered it up. The radar screen glowed emerald, and Sullivan leaned in, his eyes sharp. The technician grinned. Let's see if we can catch ourselves some ghosts. Hours later, they got their first hit, a faint, fast-moving blip just north of Nogales. It was tiny, erratic, almost playful. Lock on, Sullivan said. The radar held steady for a moment, then lost it. Damn thing dropped altitude again, muttered the technician. These pilots are hugging the terrain like it's a lover. Sullivan's jaw tightened. Then we get closer to the ground. That night, Operation Desert Veil was officially launched. The operation relied on a series of remote teams scattered across the desert, small groups of agents, radar operators, and airmen living in trailers camouflaged with netting and dust. They watched the sky every night, drinking bitter coffee, whispering into radios, and listening for the faint hum of engines that haunted the dark. Each agent carried night vision goggles and a two-way radio. If a radar picked up a blip, a nearby team would mobilize in trucks, chasing the invisible target through cactus fields and dry riverbeds. It was a miserable, thankless job. Rattlesnakes slithered under sleeping bags, coyotes prowled the perimeters, and the heat of the day was replaced by bone-chilling cold at night. But no one complained, not aloud. They were chasing ghosts, and ghosts didn't rest. One night in August, Sullivan himself joined the field team station near the San Pedro River Valley. The air was still, the moon low and red. They'd been watching the radar feed for 6 hours when a young technician suddenly pointed at the screen. There. A blip. Small. Fast. Moving north. Altitude? Sullivan asked. 600 feet. Speed, 45 knots. No transponder. Let's go. Within seconds, engines roared to life. 2 trucks sped off into the desert, headlights off, guided only by moonlight and the coordinates fed from the radar van. For 10 tense minutes, there was nothing but static on the radio. Then a whisper crackled through. Contact visual. Low flyer heading northwest. Looks like a damn bat. Sullivan grabbed his binoculars and scanned the horizon. Then he saw it, a silhouette gliding barely 20 feet above the ground, wings stretched wide, cutting through the night like a phantom. The faint hum of its motor reached his ears, a chilling sound that made the hairs on his arms rise. Keep your distance, he ordered. We want him alive. The pilot must have spotted movement below. The ultralight jerked upward, turned sharply, and accelerated west. The FBI trucks gave chase, bouncing violently over rocks and scrub. Dust clouds rose like smoke. Suddenly, the ultralight's engine sputtered. A cough, a stutter, and then silence. The craft dipped, nose down, and vanished behind a ridge. Crash site. 2 miles ahead. The agents arrived minutes later, headlights cutting across the wreckage. The ultralight lay crumpled, one wing snapped, propeller embedded in the sand. The pilot, a young man in black coveralls, was sprawled nearby, groaning but alive. FBI. Don't move. He didn't resist. His face was pale with fear. Sullivan knelt beside him. Who are you flying for? The man spat blood, eyes glassy. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. He coughed, then whispered one word before passing out. Fantasma. The captured pilot, Miguel Ortega, survived. Under interrogation, he revealed fragments that chilled Sullivan's team. The ultralights weren't launched randomly, every flight was timed to match radar downtimes, precise 5-minute windows when U.S. radar coverage dipped. Those systems don't go down by accident, Sullivan said grimly. Someone's feeding them the schedule. A traitor inside U.S. operations. But who? Customs? Air Defense? DEA? Someone high enough to know when radar would go blind, and bold enough to sell that knowledge to El Fantasma. The revelation changed everything. As Operation Desert Veil intensified, so did the cartel's countermeasures. One night, a radar van near Yuma was destroyed by an explosion, a crude pipe bomb planted under the chassis. 2 agents were injured. There was no evidence left behind, just a message scrawled in the sand near the blast site. The desert keeps secrets. So should you. The message was signed with 3 letters, EC. Sullivan's superiors were alarmed but cautious. The operation was expensive, controversial, and politically risky. We can't have a scandal, one deputy director warned him. If the public learns our radar was being used by smugglers, Washington will have our heads. Sullivan didn't care. If we don't stop him now, we'll be the ones buried under this desert. That night, he stood outside the field command post, staring into the star-flecked void. Somewhere out there, El Fantasma was watching, always one step ahead, always invisible. But Sullivan had learned something about ghosts. Even they cast shadows. And soon, he would follow those shadows into the darkest corners of his own agency. The morning after the explosion near Yuma, the desert still smelled of fuel and burned rubber. The air shimmered with heat, and the blackened skeleton of the radar van stood like a monument to failure. Agent Mark Sullivan walked the perimeter slowly, boots crunching over debris. The blast had been precise, too precise. Whoever planted the bomb knew exactly where to place it. He crouched near a patch of disturbed sand. The message, though partially erased by wind, was still visible, EC, the desert keeps secrets. So should you. Iladio Cruz was mocking him. And worse, someone on the inside had made it possible. At FBI headquarters in Phoenix, the mood was venomous. Washington demanded answers. How the hell do drug smugglers get military radar schedules? Barked Assistant Director Ray Maddox. These are classified systems. Sullivan stood at the end of the conference table, hands behind his back. Sir, I believe there's a mole inside one of the federal agencies, possibly Customs or Air Defense. Someone's feeding Cruz information about our radar downtime. Maddox leaned back, unimpressed. That's a serious allegation, Agent Sullivan. Do you have proof? Not yet, Sullivan admitted. But I can get it, if I'm allowed to investigate internally. The assistant director's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting we turn the FBI on its own partners? That's suicide. Sullivan's tone was calm but cutting. So is letting drug traffickers fly 2 tons of cocaine into the country every month while pretending our hands are clean. Maddox's jaw tightened. The room fell into uneasy silence. Finally, he said, "Fine." Quietly. "You dig, but if this leaks, you'll take the fall." "Understood." Sullivan nodded. He already knew he would. For weeks, Sullivan worked in the shadows. He pored over radar maintenance logs, communication records, and flight schedules, searching for anomalies. The pattern was subtle but real. Every ultralight incursion coincided with a radar recalibration or temporary, weather diagnostic outage. The timing was too perfect. He traced the authorizations to one department, U.S. Customs Air Surveillance. Specifically, a mid-level operations officer named Victor Hale. Hale had a spotless record, 20 years in service, no disciplinary actions. But the paper trail told another story. Bank deposits from untraceable accounts in Panama. Frequent trips to Mexico City. A suspicious mortgage payoff. Sullivan didn't want to believe it. Hale wasn't just an officer, he was a decorated veteran, a family man. But numbers didn't lie. He needed help. Quietly, he reached out to Linda Hart, a radar engineer from the Air Force who had been part of Operation Desert Veil since its inception. Linda was sharp, methodical, and fearless. She'd earned Sullivan's respect, and something bordering on friendship. When Sullivan showed her the data, her reaction was immediate. "It's insider manipulation," she said. "Someone's manually disabling radar windows just long enough for Cruz's flights to slip through. That requires direct access to the system." She tapped one of the logs. "See this line? It's a remote override. Only customs officers have that code." "Meaning Hale," Sullivan said quietly. Linda hesitated. "You realize what this means? If we expose this, it won't just be him. It'll be everyone who signed off on his clearances. You'll be going up against agencies that don't forgive leaks." Sullivan looked her straight in the eye. "Then we'll do it right. Clean, airtight, no leaks." Linda smiled grimly. "You're either brave or insane, Mark." "Probably both," he replied. Together, they set a trap. Using Air Force data, Linda created a fake radar maintenance schedule, a forged document indicating when and where radar systems would be down for repairs. If Hale was indeed feeding El Fantasma, that false schedule would reach Cruz's network. Within 48 hours, it did. The night after the fake radar downtime began, 3 ultralights launched from Sonora, following the decoy route. But this time, the FBI was waiting. High in the desert hills, radar screens flared with life. The agents watched in awe as 3 glowing dots crossed the border, clear, visible, and unprotected. For once, the ghosts had form. "Targets locked," the technician whispered. "Scramble intercept," Sullivan ordered. Moments later, 2 military helicopters roared out of the darkness, floodlights slicing across the desert floor. The ultralights panicked. One tried to climb, another turned sharply, but there was nowhere to hide. 2 crashed, one escaped back into Mexico. The operation was a success. But to Sullivan, it was more than that, it was proof. Someone inside U.S. Customs had betrayed their country. The following morning, Sullivan confronted Victor Hale in his Phoenix office. Hale looked startled but composed. "Agent Sullivan. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Sullivan dropped a folder onto the desk. Bank records. Wire transfers. Panama accounts. And a photo, Hale meeting a known cartel intermediary in Mexico City. For a moment, Hale's smile faltered. Then he sighed. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." "Why, Hale?" Sullivan asked, voice low. "Why sell out your country?" Hale's eyes hardened. "You think Washington cares about the border? About men like me? 20 years, Mark. 20 years of service, and they cut our funding, lay off my team, strip us of equipment. Meanwhile, politicians shake hands with the same people we're supposed to arrest." He leaned forward, bitterness dripping from every word. "You're chasing ghosts. I just stopped pretending they weren't real." Before Sullivan could reply, Hale hit a hidden alarm beneath his desk. The lights flickered, security rushed in, but by the time they arrived, Hale was gone. Hours later, Mexican authorities found a small private plane abandoned near Hermosillo. Inside, a burned passport, a melted handgun, and a note in Spanish. "The ghost always finds his own sky." It was signed VH. Hale had vanished. The fallout was immediate. Washington was furious, not at the mole, but at Sullivan. He'd embarrassed half the federal agencies in the country. Funding for Operation Desert Veil was suspended, pending review. Assistant Director Maddox called him in. "You went too far. You humiliated people who write your paycheck. This operation is finished." Sullivan glared back. "So is your integrity." He left the office without turning back. That night, Linda found him sitting alone outside the radar compound, staring at the desert horizon. The stars shimmered above them, beautiful and indifferent. "They shut it down," she said softly. "I know. So what now?" Sullivan looked up at the endless night sky. "Cruz is still out there. And if Hale's alive, he's with him." Linda hesitated. "You can't chase ghosts forever." He smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But I can make them visible." And as the wind swept across the sand, somewhere deep in the Sonoran night, El Fantasma prepared his next move, one that would push the FBI, the government, and the truth itself to the breaking point. It began with silence. The kind of silence that follows when truth becomes too loud to ignore. 2 weeks after the shutdown of Operation Desert Veil, the desert seemed quieter, emptier, but Mark Sullivan knew better. The ghosts hadn't vanished, they'd just grown bolder. And so had he. He'd been officially reassigned to desk duty in Phoenix, his files sealed, his badge under review. Washington wanted to sweep the scandal under the rug, to bury Hale's betrayal before the press could smell blood. But Sullivan wasn't built to sit behind glass. Late one night, in the empty field office, he pulled out the operation's confiscated evidence, maps, radar logs, intercepted radio transmissions, all locked in a cabinet marked inactive. He spread them across the floor. That's when he saw it. A pattern that no one else had noticed. The ultralight routes Hale had cleared weren't random. They weren't smuggling corridors, they were corridors around military testing zones. What the hell were they avoiding? Sullivan whispered to himself. He checked coordinates. Each route skirted just outside restricted airspace used by the U.S. Air Force for drone and missile trials. The smugglers weren't just ferrying cocaine, they were mapping radar blind spots that only the Pentagon should have known about. This wasn't just corruption. It was espionage. He called Linda Hart. She answered on the first ring. "Mark? You're not supposed to be calling me." "I found something," he said, voice tense. The flight paths, they weren't only for drugs. They were tracing U.S. defense coverage. Linda was silent for a moment. "You're saying Cruz was mapping American radar systems? That's a betrayal beyond drugs. Someone wanted this data sold." "Who?" Sullivan exhaled. "That's what I'm going to find out." Linda's tone darkened. "They'll come for you, Mark. You're already suspended." He smiled grimly. "Then they'll have to catch me." The next day, Sullivan drove south, alone, unarmed, and unauthorized. He crossed into the desert near Nogales under the pretense of visiting a retired informant. In reality, he was following a trail that Victor Hale had started. For 2 days, he wandered through dusty towns where everyone looked twice before answering a question. Finally, in a dilapidated cantina near the border, a man in a torn denim jacket approached him. "You're looking for ghosts," the man said in Spanish. "I know where one hides." Sullivan bought him a drink. The man leaned in, voice low. "Hale is alive. He's working with Cruz. They're not running drugs anymore. They're running something bigger, American secrets." "Where?" The man slid a piece of paper across the table, a set of coordinates. "You didn't get this from me." Then he was gone. That night, Sullivan hiked to the coordinates under a moonless sky. The wind howled through the desert like a warning. When he reached the ridge, he froze. Below him, in a dry ravine, were 3 ultralights, modified beyond recognition, larger engines, reinforced wings, and strange, dome-like pods mounted beneath. A team of men loaded crates onto the aircraft. Even in the dim light, Sullivan could make out military-grade electronics, signal processors, encrypted drives, even radar arrays. He raised his binoculars. Standing near the planes, calm and composed, was Victor Hale. And beside him, smiling faintly, was Iladio, El Fantasma, Cruz. They shook hands. Sullivan's blood ran cold. He lifted his camera, snapping photos rapidly. But before he could leave, a sound cut through the night, the metallic click of a safety being released. "Don't move, Agent Sullivan." The voice behind him was steady, female, Linda's. He turned slowly, disbelief etched across his face. Linda? She lowered her weapon slightly. I didn't want to do this. Do what? He hissed. She swallowed hard. They got to me, Mark. They knew we were digging. The Air Force contractor, they made an offer I couldn't refuse. Do you think they'd let me walk after discovering they sold radar data to the cartel? Sullivan's chest tightened. You're working for them now? I'm surviving, she said softly. And you should have done the same. He shook his head. You sold out everything we fought for. Her voice broke. You still think this is about right and wrong? It's about who gets to rewrite the story. Behind them, headlights flared. Trucks roared up the ridge. Armed men spilled out, surrounding Sullivan. Hale stepped forward, smirking. Agent Sullivan, he said smoothly. You really should have stayed behind your desk. Sullivan's mind raced. You're selling U.S. defense data to the cartel? Hale laughed. Oh, not to the cartel. They're just the couriers. The buyers are offshore, and very generous. He gestured to Linda. You see, Mark, even good people have a price. I just learned mine early. Sullivan's fists clenched. You're going to burn for this, Hale. Hale tilted his head. Maybe. But you won't live to see it. He nodded to his men. Two of them moved forward. But before they could reach him, the night exploded, literally. A blinding flash lit the ravine as one of the ultralights detonated. A fireball ripped through the site, throwing debris and chaos everywhere. Hale and Cruz dove for cover. Sullivan tackled Linda, pulling her behind a boulder as bullets tore through the air. Who set that off? She shouted. Sullivan looked at her, eyes wide, breath ragged. You tell me. She shook her head. Not me. Through the chaos, Sullivan spotted a dark figure retreating up the ridge, slim, agile, moving fast. Someone had triggered the explosion remotely. The figure paused just long enough for the firelight to catch their face. For a fraction of a second, Sullivan saw it, and his blood froze. It was Assistant Director Ray Maddox. By dawn, the site was gone, burned, scattered, erased. Cruz escaped again. Hale vanished into Mexico. Linda disappeared without a trace. Sullivan made it out alive, barely. The next morning, he sent the photos he'd taken to 3 trusted journalists, along with a message. If I don't make it, the truth still will. Hours later, the FBI declared him a fugitive. His face flashed across internal bulletins with the words, armed and dangerous. But the truth? The truth was even more dangerous than he was. He vanished into the desert, just as El Fantasma had years before. Now he was the ghost. And in Washington, powerful men began to panic, because Mark Sullivan was still alive. 3 weeks after the explosion in Sonora, the American Southwest was on fire, not with flames, but with scandal. The headlines were merciless. Leaked FBI files reveal cross-border corruption. U.S. defense data sold to cartel, high-ranking officials implicated. Anonymous source known only as Spectre sends proof to media. No one knew who Spectre was. But Mark Sullivan did. Because Spectre was him. He hadn't planned to become a whistleblower, or a fugitive. But after the Sonoran massacre, he realized there was no going back. The system wasn't just infected, it was built to protect the infection. From a makeshift hideout deep in the Arizona desert, a forgotten Cold War bunker buried under sand, Sullivan launched his counterattack. He transmitted encrypted files to journalists, congressional aides, even foreign embassies. He had no illusions of safety, only purpose. Each drop was surgical. A bank record here. A memo there. A photo of Hale shaking hands with Cruz in Mexico City. A wire transfer from a Pentagon contractor's account to a Cayman bank. The truth spread like wildfire. And Washington panicked. Assistant Director Ray Maddox, the man Sullivan had seen at the explosion site, went on television. His face was pale, his tone steady. This so-called Spectre, Maddox declared, is a dangerous criminal, responsible for leaking classified material and endangering national security. He paused for effect. Mark Sullivan is no hero. He's a traitor. The country divided overnight. Some called Sullivan a patriot. Others branded him a lunatic. Talk shows dissected his motives, conspiracy forums turned him into a legend. Meanwhile, the FBI launched Operation Iron Veil, a manhunt across 4 states. But the man they hunted knew their every move. From his desert bunker, Sullivan intercepted their radio chatter. He still had allies, quiet ones. Old friends in low places who didn't trust the Bureau's new cleanup. One night, as he listened to the radio hiss, a faint voice came through. "Mark, it's me." He froze. "Linda." Her voice cracked. "They think I'm dead. I've been hiding in Nogales. I saw Hale." Sullivan's heart pounded. "You're sure?" "Yes. He's alive, and Cruz is moving again. But it's not drugs anymore. They're transporting something heavier, crates labeled aerial guidance components. Mark, this isn't just about smuggling. It's about selling America's defense systems to whoever pays." "Coordinates?" he asked. She whispered them quickly. "Near San Luis. They're flying tonight." Then the line went dead. Sullivan had no backup. No agency. No legal ground. But he had purpose, and fury. He loaded his old rifle, packed his maps, and set out under the cover of darkness. The desert air bit cold against his skin. The night sky glowed faintly with starlight. He drove off-road until the headlights caught the faint outline of hangars in the distance, rusted metal structures, half buried in sand. He parked, killed the engine, and watched. Inside, floodlights flickered. Men moved like ants, preparing ultralights with strange, bulky cargo. The markings on the crates were unmistakable: U.S. defense contractor, restricted equipment. And there, standing in the middle, was Victor Hale, alive and calm, clipboard in hand. Sullivan steadied his breath. "Time to end this," he whispered. He slipped through the shadows, every step a whisper. The hum of engines filled the air. He crept up behind a storage crate, raised his camera, and began recording. He had to get proof, undeniable, clear, and public. Then a voice behind him. "I knew you'd come." He turned. Hale stood 10 feet away, gun drawn, expression eerily serene. "You never learn to quit," Hale said softly. "That's why you'll die in the dark." "Not before the truth gets out," Sullivan replied. "Oh, it already did." Hale smirked. "You think those leaks hurt us? They just cleared the board. The small fish took the fall. The real players moved up." He gestured toward the hangars. "This is sanctioned now. Government contracts. Private security logistics. Legal, on paper. But off the books? We sell to whoever needs a radar gap, cartels, dictators, even your beloved allies. Everyone gets a share." Sullivan stared in disbelief. "You turned treason into a business." Hale's grin widened. "We call it policy." The standoff stretched. Wind howled through the open doors. Then, a sound overhead. A low, mechanical hum. Spotlights burst through the night sky, blinding them both. Helicopters, black, unmarked. Hale's eyes widened. "They're early." Before he could finish, bullets rained down. The hangars erupted in chaos. Men shouted, ran, fired back. Sullivan dove behind a crate, clutching his rifle. He recognized the flight pattern, military precision, but not U.S. Army. These were contractors, hired guns. He crawled toward the rear exit. In the chaos, he saw Hale grab a crate and flee toward a waiting truck. Sullivan fired once. The bullet shattered the windshield. Hale ducked, floored the gas, and roared off into the desert. Moments later, the hangars exploded, flames reaching skyward, casting twisted shadows across the sand. Sullivan stumbled away, ears ringing, lungs burning. He didn't know if Cruz was dead or alive. He didn't know if Linda had survived. But he knew one thing: the operation wasn't rogue anymore. It was protected. By dawn, the official story hit the airwaves. Explosion at illegal airfield linked to drug cartel. No U.S. personnel involved. Clean. Efficient. A lie. Sullivan sat atop a canyon ridge, radio crackling beside him. The morning sun bled orange over the dunes. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage. He whispered to himself, "They buried the truth again." Then the radio hissed, and Linda's voice came through, faint but alive. "Mark, listen carefully. There's one more thing you need to know." "What?" "Cruz isn't dead. He's meeting someone in D.C. next week, a defense lobbyist. He's not a ghost anymore. He's walking through the front door." Sullivan froze. The desert wind swept over him. If El Fantasma was stepping into Washington itself, the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. He stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Then I'll meet him there," he said quietly. The camera he'd used to film Hale's operation was tucked safely in his bag, its footage already transmitted to a dozen hidden servers. He looked back once at the burning horizon, a graveyard of secrets, then started walking east, toward the rising sun. For the first time, the hunter and the ghost were heading for the same city. And Washington had no idea what was coming. Washington, D.C., 6 months after the Sonora explosion. The capital gleamed with false purity. Marble buildings reflected the morning light, monuments stood tall, and tourists strolled past fountains, blissfully unaware that beneath their feet, power shifted like sand in a storm. Mark Sullivan stood across from the Capitol, dressed in a worn gray suit, hair longer, face leaner. He was no longer an agent, not officially, not legally. But his purpose had never been clearer. He had returned to expose El Fantasma, and the men who had turned the government into his partner. Inside a luxury hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, a secret defense conference was underway. The kind of event where billion-dollar contracts were sealed over champagne. Among the guests was Eladio Cruz, the man the world still believed was a Mexican rancher and philanthropist. He wore a tailored navy suit, a gold watch, and the calm smile of a man who'd bought his own reputation. Beside him, whispering to lobbyists and senators, was Ray Maddox, the FBI assistant director who had branded Sullivan a traitor. They shook hands like old friends. Cameras flashed. To the world, it looked like diplomacy. To Sullivan, it looked like treason. In a small D.C. apartment, Sullivan prepared his final move. He'd spent months gathering the last fragments of proof, encrypted memos, offshore bank transfers, security logs linking Maddox, Hale, and Cruz. The footage from the Sonoran airfield was the key. He'd arranged a live drop, one journalist from every major network, all waiting at the National Press Club that afternoon. Once he went live, there'd be no stopping it. He checked his watch. 2 hours to go. Then the phone buzzed. "Mark," came a voice, familiar, breathless. "It's me. Linda." His chest tightened. "You're alive." "Barely. I've been hiding overseas. But listen, you can't go public yet." "Why not?" "They already know you're here. Maddox set you up. He's using Cruz's arrival as bait. They plan to kill you, call it a terrorist incident, and bury everything under national security." Sullivan paused. "And you?" "I'm sorry, Mark. I told them you'd come." A cold silence followed. "You did what?" he whispered. "They promised to clear my record," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't think they'd." But the line went dead. An hour later, the streets around the hotel swarmed with unmarked SUVs and plainclothes agents. Sullivan watched from across the street, adjusting the small camera pinned to his lapel. He wasn't here to run anymore. He was here to end it. Inside the ballroom, Cruz stepped to the podium, smiling for the press. "Today," he said in flawless English, "we celebrate cooperation, not division. The future of our skies belongs to partnership." Applause echoed. Maddox stood nearby, nodding approvingly. Then, as Cruz raised his glass, a voice cut through the crowd, calm, unmistakable. "Funny," said Sullivan, stepping through the doors, "I thought the future of our skies belonged to the people who built them." Gasps filled the room. Cameras swung toward him. Security lunged, but he raised a hand. "Before you arrest me," he said, "you should see this." He pressed a button on a small remote. The screens behind Cruz flickered, and then, footage filled the ballroom. The Sonoran airfield. Hale loading radar crates. Cruz signing manifests. Maddox giving orders. The room fell into stunned silence. Reporters froze, their pens hanging midair. Cruz's smile cracked. Maddox's face drained of color. "This," Sullivan said, voice steady, "is what your government calls cooperation. A cartel smuggler and an FBI director selling national security to the highest bidder." Cruz turned to Maddox, whispering sharply in Spanish. Maddox's jaw clenched. Security rushed forward. Sullivan didn't resist. He held his ground as the cameras rolled. "You can arrest me," he said, "but the files are already uploaded. Every major network has them. Every senator's office. Every newsroom in this city. The truth's out." Maddox's mask shattered. "You're finished, Sullivan." "No," Sullivan replied quietly. "You are." Chaos erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Agents scrambled for Maddox. Crews slipped out a side door. Outside, sirens wailed. News trucks raced in. The story was live within minutes. FBI official implicated in international smuggling scandal. Cartel leader caught in Washington dealings. The footage was everywhere, and it was undeniable. By nightfall, Cruz was under diplomatic protection at the Mexican embassy. Maddox was placed on administrative leave. The Bureau scrambled to control the narrative. And Mark Sullivan disappeared again. Some said he fled the country. Others claimed the CIA took him in. But 1 week later, an envelope arrived at the Washington Post. Inside was a single photo, taken from a ridge overlooking the desert, the sun rising over the sand. On the back, one line was written. Even ghosts leave footprints. Months passed. Hearings began. The scandal devoured half of Washington. Maddox was indicted. Several defense contractors collapsed. As for Cruz, El Fantasma, he vanished once more, somewhere south of Veracruz. No extradition. No trial. Just silence. But every now and then, pilots along the border reported strange lights in the sky, faint, gliding, silent. And the locals would whisper, "The ghost still flies." Years later, a documentary aired about the affair. In its final scene, an unseen interviewer asked a question. "Do you believe Mark Sullivan was a hero?" The former agent being interviewed smiled faintly. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who saw the truth and refused to look away. The interviewer leaned forward. "And what about El Fantasma?" A pause. Then the man chuckled softly. "The funny thing about ghosts," he said, "is that sometimes they look a lot like us." The camera panned to the night sky, dark, infinite, and quiet. A faint hum rose in the distance, just at the edge of hearing. Then, cutting across the stars, a single ultralight plane drifted, slow, graceful, and silent. No one knew if it was Sullivan, Cruz, or someone new. But one thing was certain. The sky still had secrets. And the ghosts were still flying.